Welcome, weary travelers, to the gentle realm where impossible theories drift through the corridors of imagination, like whispered bedtime stories that will never come to pass. Tonight, we journey through the quieter spaces of speculation, exploring the fan theories that emerge from love of our beloved small town, but wander far from the carefully constructed truths that make Hawkins' story so compelling. So settle into your most comfortable sanctuary. Let the soft glow of understanding wash over you and allow these explorations to carry you into peaceful slumber as we discover why some ideas, however creative, must remain forever in the realm of dreams. The theory that captures perhaps more passionate discussion than any other in the shadowed corners of online speculation suggests that Henry Creel, the sensitive child who would grow into the monster known as Vecna, is actually Eleven's biological father, his connection to her stemming not from shared laboratory experience or parallel psychic development, but from the most fundamental bond that exists between human beings, the sacred relationship between parent and child that shapes identity and destiny in ways that go far deeper than training or circumstance could ever reach. The appeal of this theory grows from the same soil that nourishes the most compelling family dramas, the revelation that enemies were once connected by love, that battles between good and evil carry the additional weight of betrayed trust and wounded affection, transforming supernatural conflict into deeply personal tragedy, where victory comes only through the heartbreak of destroying someone whose blood runs through your own veins, whose earliest influence shaped the very foundations of who you became before the world. Intervene to twist love into something unrecognizable. Those who embrace this speculation point to Henry's apparent fixation on Eleven during their confrontations, interpreting his intense focus and emotional investment as evidence of paternal recognition rather than the professional interest of someone who understands her capabilities, or the ideological obsession of a being who sees in her both his greatest threat and his most promising potential convert to his philosophy about human nature and the necessity of reshaping reality according to principles that reject conventional morality in favor of power exercised without restraint or mercy. The laboratory imagery that surrounds both characters provides fertile ground for those who seek connections between their stories. The sterile corridors and experimental chambers creating visual echoes that seem to suggest deeper relationships than simple institutional coincidence, while the frequent references to blood in scientific contexts and the symbolic importance of biological material in psychic research combine to create atmosphere where familial revelations might feel not only possible but somehow inevitable, given the show's careful attention to how genetics and environment interact to produce extraordinary abilities. The dramatic appeal of such a revelation cannot be understated, particularly for audiences who have learned to expect that the most emotionally devastating twists often prove to be the most meaningful ones, that stories which dare to complicate relationships through unexpected connections frequently reward viewers with richer understanding of character motivations and deeper appreciation for the sacrifices that heroism demands when personal loyalty conflicts with moral necessity and individual choice, must navigate the treacherous territory between love and justice. Yet, the foundation upon which this theory attempts to build reveals significant cracks when examined against the careful architecture that the series has constructed around both Henry's origins and Eleven's parentage. The detailed backstories that have been revealed through multiple seasons of character development and plot revelation, providing clear answers to questions that this speculation seeks to complicate through dramatic enhancement rather than logical extension of established narrative threads. Henry Creel's childhood has been documented with meticulous attention to detail, from his family's arrival in Hawkins through his gradual recognition of his own abilities and his growing conviction that ordinary human relationships represented weakness and limitation rather than sources of strength and meaning. His transformation from sensitive child to calculating predator, occurring within the context of his original family environment, rather than through later experiences that might have included romantic relationships or parenthood that could have resulted in children whose existence remained hidden from official records. The timeline that governs Henry's institutionalization and subsequent years within Hawkins National Laboratory demonstrates that his captivity began during early adolescence and continued without interruption until his escape. The rigid control exercised by Dr. Brenner and his staff making romantic relationships or opportunities for reproduction virtually impossible to achieve or conceal from authorities whose surveillance extended to every aspect of the subjects' lives and whose documentation practices would certainly have recorded any pregnancies or births that occurred within their facility. Eleven's actual parentage, meanwhile, has been established through the tragic story of Terry Ives, the young woman whose participation in government experiments during the 1970s resulted in pregnancy and the subsequent loss of her daughter to institutional forces that claimed Jane for their own purposes. The legal battles and psychological trauma that defined Terry's later life, providing clear evidence of maternal connection that exists independent of any involvement with Henry Creel, or the experiments that would eventually transform him into Vecna. The relationship between Terry and Andrew Rich, documented through their shared participation in the research program that would ultimately destroy their lives and separate them from their daughter, provides complete explanation for Eleven's conception and birth, without requiring additional romantic entanglements that would complicate an already tragic narrative, while adding unnecessary complexity to character relationships that derive their power from simpler, more fundamental connections between people who shared experiences of institutional betrayal and governmental abuse. Dr. Brenner's experimental programs, as revealed through multiple seasons of careful exposition, focused on replicating and enhancing psychic abilities through scientific methods that combined pharmaceutical intervention with psychological conditioning and controlled environmental factors, his research interests centering on the practical applications of mental powers rather than the genetic manipulation or breeding programs that would have been necessary to support theories about deliberately created family relationships between subjects whose abilities served his institutional objectives. The philosophical framework that drives Vecna's actions demonstrates understanding of power and human nature that developed through his own experiences with conventional family relationships and social expectations rather than through the complex emotions that biological parenthood typically creates in people who have created new life and accepted responsibility for nurturing and protecting vulnerable children who depend upon their care and guidance for survival and healthy development. His interactions with Eleven during their confrontations reveal the calculated interest of someone who recognizes both threat and opportunity in her abilities, rather than the deeper emotional complexity that would characterize encounters between estranged family members whose relationship had been severed by circumstances beyond their control. His attempts to recruit her to his cause reflecting ideological conviction rather than paternal concern for her welfare or happiness. The chosen family theme that runs throughout Stranger Things, like a golden thread connecting all its most meaningful relationships, demonstrates that the series values bonds created through mutual care and shared experience over those determined by genetic accident. Joyce and Hopper's adoption of Eleven providing far more compelling exploration of what parenthood means when it emerges from love and commitment rather than biological inevitability or romantic circumstance. The emotional weight that gives Eleven's relationship with Hopper its particular resonance comes precisely from the fact that their connection was chosen rather than inherited. Their gradual development of trust and affection, proving that families can be created through deliberate acts of care, rather than requiring biological foundation to achieve the kind of deep loyalty and mutual support that sustains people through crisis and provides meaning during ordinary moments, when dramatic events do not demand heroic responses. Converting Eleven's relationship with her true enemy into a family drama would diminish rather than enhance the moral complexity of her situation, replacing the clear ethical framework that positions her as protector of innocent people against someone who has chosen to embrace cruelty and domination, with the murky psychological territory of family dysfunction where right and wrong become more difficult to distinguish. And victory requires not just courage, but the willingness to destroy someone whose genetic connection creates obligation and emotional complication that heroism should not require. The carefully constructed parallel between Henry's philosophy of human inadequacy and Eleven's growing understanding of human worth would lose its thematic power if transformed from ideological conflict into family disagreement. The universal significance of their battle between hope and despair, becoming merely personal drama that might interest viewers who enjoy complicated family relationships, but would fail to provide the broader moral framework that gives their conflict meaning. Beyond the immediate circumstances of their supernatural abilities, the theory ultimately reveals more about audience desire for dramatic complexity than about the actual needs of the story being told. The appeal of surprise parentage, reflecting the influence of other narratives where such revelations have provided emotional payoff without considering whether this particular story would benefit from similar complications or would instead be damaged by the addition of family dynamics that would overshadow the themes and relationships that have already been established as the series' emotional and moral foundation. The laboratory environment that shaped both characters' early experiences with their abilities creates sufficient connection between their stories without requiring biological relationship to explain their understanding of each other's capabilities or their recognition of the stakes involved in their eventual confrontation, their shared trauma under institutional control, providing adequate foundation for the complex emotions that characterize their interactions without adding unnecessary genetic complications that would muddy rather than clarify the moral framework that governs their conflict. The theory that Eddie Munson will return from his heroic death in the Upside Down as Cass the Vampire represents perhaps the most emotionally understandable of all impossible speculations, born from the genuine love that audiences developed for a character whose brief appearance in the series created such profound impact that his loss feels like tragedy too great to accept as permanent, his sacrifice too meaningful to allow the finality that death typically brings to stories where beloved characters disappear forever from the narrative landscape they help to illuminate. The appeal of this particular resurrection theory grows from soil that has been carefully cultivated through decades of fantasy storytelling, where death serves as temporary setback rather than ultimate conclusion, where beloved characters who fall in noble service to their companions often return transformed but recognizable, their loyalty intact, despite physical changes that mark them as different from their original selves, while preserving the essential qualities that made audiences care about their fate in the first place. Eddie's death scene itself provides what seems like obvious symbolic foundation for vampiric transformation. The demobats that swarm around his fallen form, creating visual echoes of the creatures traditionally associated with undead resurrection in folklore, that stretches back centuries, while his willing sacrifice to protect his friends mirrors the kind of noble death that mythology often rewards with supernatural return. His courage in facing impossible odds demonstrating character traits that seem worthy of preservation through whatever means fantasy might provide. The connection to Dungeons and Dragons lore adds another layer of apparent credibility to speculation about Eddie's potential return. Kaz the vampire occupying significant place in the game's mythology as the lieutenant who ultimately betrays and destroys Vecna, the parallel seeming too perfect to ignore, when considered alongside Eddie's established role as Dungeon Master, whose understanding of the game's complex relationships between heroes and villains provided framework for understanding the supernatural threats that invaded Hawkins and demanded response from ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The poetic justice that would result from Eddie's return as the instrument of Vecna's destruction appeals to audiences who appreciate narrative symmetry, where those who suffer most at the hands of evil ultimately become the agents of its defeat. His transformation from misunderstood outcast, accused of satanic influence, into literal creature of darkness, who serves the cause of light, representing the kind of ironic reversal that seems to promise deeper meaning than simple coincidence could provide. The fan community's passionate attachment to Eddie's character creates emotional investment that makes permanent loss feel unnecessarily cruel. His journey from social pariah to genuine hero occurring so rapidly and powerfully that viewers who connected with his struggle against unfair judgment and social exclusion experience his death as personal grief that seeks resolution through whatever narrative mechanisms might allow continued relationship with someone whose brief presence provided inspiration and validation for people who recognized aspects of their own experiences in his story. Yet, the fundamental misunderstanding that underlies this theory reveals itself when examined against the actual relationship that Stranger Things has maintained with its Dungeons and Dragons source material throughout 4 seasons of careful world building, the game serving consistently as thematic framework and symbolic language rather than literal roadmap for plot development, its monsters and mythology providing vocabulary for understanding supernatural phenomena rather than determining the specific mechanisms through which that understanding would be applied to resolve narrative conflicts. The Demogorgon that terrorized Hawkins during the series' first season borrowed only its name from the game's bestiary. Its actual characteristics and behavior patterns developed according to the story's internal logic, rather than the rule systems that governed tabletop encounters. The creature's relationship to the Upside Down, and its hunting methods reflecting the specific needs of television narrative rather than faithful adaptation of gaming mechanics that would have constrained creative possibilities and limited dramatic potential. Vecna himself represents similar adaptation of gaming mythology to serve television storytelling needs. His identity as Henry Creel and his backstory as institutionalized psychic subject, bearing little resemblance to the undead Lich King that players encounter in gaming campaigns. His motivations and abilities developed through careful attention to character psychology and thematic resonance, rather than adherence to predetermined characteristics that would have limited the writer's ability to create compelling, personal stakes for the human characters whose growth and relationships provide the series' emotional foundation. The pattern that emerges from examining how Stranger Things has consistently used Dungeons and Dragons elements demonstrates clear preference for symbolic resonance over literal translation, the game's concepts providing rich, metaphorical language that helps characters and audiences understand complex supernatural phenomena, while never constraining the story's development according to external rules that might conflict with internal narrative logic or character development, needs that serve the specific themes and emotional journeys that define the series' unique identity. Eddie's death itself was crafted with deliberate attention to finality and meaning that would be undermined rather than enhanced by supernatural reversal. His choice to stop running and face the creatures that threatened Dustin, representing fundamental character growth that transformed him from someone who fled difficult situations into someone willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of people he had learned to love. His evolution from self-preservation to selflessness, creating arc that gains power through its completion rather than continuation. The guitar solo that served as Eddie's final heroic act created imagery that was both beautiful and tragic, his performance drawing the Demobats away from his friends, while simultaneously serving as declaration of identity and values that refused to be silenced by social condemnation or supernatural threat. The music representing his authentic self, expressed without apology or compromise in the face of certain death that he accepted willingly rather than allowing harm to come to people whose friendship had taught him what truly mattered in life. The weight of Eddie's sacrifice depends entirely upon its permanence, the courage required to face death for others' sake, losing all meaning. If death proves to be temporary inconvenience rather than ultimate price paid for love and loyalty, his heroism measured not by survival, but by willingness to give up survival. When circumstances demanded such sacrifice from someone whose growth had prepared him to make choices based on others' welfare rather than personal safety or comfort, bringing Eddie back as vampiric servant of justice would introduce supernatural mechanics that exist nowhere else in the series' carefully constructed mythology. The psychic powers and interdimensional phenomena that define the Upside Down's relationship to Hawkins, operating according to mental energy and trauma, rather than the biological transformation that would be required to support undead resurrection. The addition of vampiric elements representing genre shift that would feel foreign to story that has maintained consistent rules about how supernatural forces interact with human characters. The emotional impact that Eddie's return might provide for audiences who miss his presence would be purchased at the cost of narrative integrity that gives all character deaths in the series their power to move viewers and motivate heroes to greater courage, the understanding that loss is permanent, creating stakes that make every dangerous choice meaningful, while teaching characters and audiences alike that love requires willingness to accept grief as the price of caring deeply about people whose lives matter more than our own comfort. The memory of Eddie that lives on in the characters who knew him provides more appropriate vehicle for honoring his contribution to their development than physical resurrection that would cheapen his sacrifice while creating logical problems about why other beloved characters who have died heroically throughout the series have not received similar supernatural reprieve from the consequences of their noble choices, the precedent of magical return, undermining the moral framework that makes heroism meaningful in the first place. Dustin's ongoing grief and growth in response to Eddie's loss represents a healthier approach to processing tragedy than fantasy solutions that avoid the difficult work of learning to carry love for someone whose physical presence has been permanently removed from the world. The young man's development of strength and courage, inspired by his mentor's example, providing more meaningful continuation of Eddie's influence than literal presence that would eliminate the need for such internal growth and character development. The flashbacks and memories that could preserve Eddie's presence in the final season offer ways to maintain his influence on the story while respecting the finality of his death. His words of encouragement and examples of courage living on in the minds and hearts of people whose lives he touched during his brief but powerful time as part of their community. His legacy measured by changes he inspired in others, rather than his own continued existence in altered form. The series' commitment to showing genuine consequences for heroic choices creates moral framework where courage means something precisely because it costs something, where characters grow through facing loss and learning to find meaning in sacrifice rather than being rescued from such difficult lessons by supernatural interventions that would remove the emotional weight that makes their journey toward maturity and wisdom feel earned rather than granted through narrative convenience. The basement where Eddie ran his Dungeons and Dragons campaigns will forever carry the echo of his voice and the memory of his creativity, the stories he told, and the adventures he guided, providing testament to his impact that requires no physical presence to remain powerful and meaningful to people whose lives were changed by knowing someone who learned to choose love over fear when circumstances demanded the ultimate demonstration of what he had learned about what truly mattered in a world where monsters were real and heroism was measured by willingness to protect the innocent, regardless of personal cost. The theory that positions Will Byers as the secret architect of the Mind Flayer, or the future ultimate villain of Stranger Things, represents one of the most psychologically troubling speculations that has emerged from fan communities, its appeal rooted in the dramatic possibility that the innocent child whose disappearance launched the entire series might ultimately be revealed as the hidden mastermind behind all the supernatural terror that has plagued Hawkins, his apparent victimhood serving as elaborate disguise for malevolent intelligence that has been orchestrating events from the beginning according to plans that no one suspected until too late to prevent their completion. The surface plausibility of this theory emerges from Will's undeniable connection to the Upside Down that persists long after his physical rescue from that nightmare realm, his continued sensitivity to the Mind Flayer's presence and activities, creating ongoing vulnerability that manifests in seizures and visions that provide both early warning system for supernatural threats and persistent reminder that his experience in that dark mirror world left marks that may never fully heal. His psychic link to forces of chaos and destruction, suggesting possibilities for influence that might flow in directions other than those that have been observed and documented. The second season of the series provided particularly fertile ground for such speculation when Will's possession by the Mind Flayer demonstrated the extent to which his consciousness could be invaded and manipulated by hostile intelligence. His temporary transformation into unwilling spy, revealing how completely his perceptions and loyalties could be altered by forces that operated beyond normal human understanding. The episodes where he struggled against mental colonization, showing audiences just how thin the line could become between victim and collaborator when supernatural powers targeted vulnerable minds. The psychological appeal of villain revelation theories grows from the same soil that nourishes the most disturbing plot twists in horror and thriller narratives. The possibility that someone we have been taught to care about and protect might actually be the source of danger rather than its target, that our emotional investment in their welfare has been manipulated by storytellers who understand that the greatest betrayals come from those we trust most completely, their innocent appearance serving as perfect camouflage for malevolent intentions that achieve maximum impact through delayed revelation. Will's artistic sensitivity and his preference for creative pursuits over more conventional masculine activities during his early childhood created character traits that some observers interpret as evidence of difference that might extend beyond simple personality variation into areas of fundamental moral divergence. His quiet nature and introspective tendencies providing what seems like perfect cover for someone whose inner life might harbor thoughts and plans that would horrify people who assume his gentleness reflects inherent goodness rather than calculated performance designed to deflect suspicion. The ongoing isolation that Will experiences as a result of his supernatural experiences creates social dynamics that could theoretically foster resentment against friends and family who cannot truly understand what he has endured. His growing distance from normal teenage concerns and relationships, potentially creating psychological space where darker influences might take root and flourish away from the protective oversight of people who love him but lack the ability to perceive threats that operate on levels beyond ordinary human awareness. The prophetic dreams and visions that provide Will with information about Mind Flayer activities could theoretically be interpreted as evidence of communication rather than simple psychic sensitivity. His ability to anticipate supernatural events, potentially resulting from advanced knowledge provided by malevolent intelligence that uses him as conduit for information rather than unwilling recipient of psychic broadcasts. His warnings to others serving dual purpose of maintaining his cover while ensuring that responses to threats unfold according to predetermined patterns that serve larger strategic objectives. Yet the fundamental misunderstanding that underlies such theories becomes apparent when examined against the careful documentation of Will's character development throughout 4 seasons of consistent behavior patterns that demonstrate his essential goodness, even when tested by circumstances that would excuse moral compromise. His responses to trauma and supernatural influence revealing someone whose core identity remains intact despite external pressures that might have corrupted someone with different foundational values and emotional support systems. The relationship between Will and the Mind Flayer was established clearly as parasitic invasion rather than collaborative partnership, the creature's presence in his consciousness representing violation of his mental autonomy rather than willing alliance between compatible intelligences, his struggle against possession demonstrating desperate resistance to foreign influence rather than gradual acceptance of shared goals, his ultimate liberation from mental colonization requiring intervention from people who recognize the difference between his authentic self and the hostile intelligence that had temporarily displaced it. The source of the Mind Flayer's physical form and ideological framework has been revealed through careful exposition that traces its current manifestation directly to Henry Creel's influence and philosophical vision, the creature serving as extension of his worldview, rather than independent entity with its own agenda, its activities and objectives reflecting his understanding of human nature and his conviction that reality should be reshaped according to principles that reject conventional morality in favor of power exercised without restraint or mercy toward those he considers weak. Will's ongoing sensitivity to upside-down activities operates according to principles similar to those that govern trauma responses in victims of severe psychological abuse, his nervous system remaining hyper-alert to threats that share characteristics with previous experiences of harm. His ability to detect supernatural presence, reflecting protective mechanism, developed through survival rather than evidence of continued connection to forces that once targeted him for reasons that had nothing to do with his character, choices. The seizures and flashbacks that mark Will's continued struggle with supernatural trauma demonstrate classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress rather than evidence of ongoing collaboration with hostile forces. His physical and emotional responses to Mind Flayer proximity, revealing someone whose system recognizes and reacts to genuine threat, rather than someone who maintains comfortable relationship with source of previous harm. His distress during these episodes indicating rejection of rather than acceptance of the influence that continues to affect him. The artistic expressions that provide Will with outlet for processing his supernatural experiences reveal someone whose creative instincts remain focused on communication and understanding rather than manipulation or deception. His drawings and other artistic works serving as attempts to make sense of traumatic experiences rather than coded messages designed to coordinate with malevolent forces. His use of creativity as healing mechanism, demonstrating healthy psychological responses to circumstances that might have overwhelmed someone with less resilient support systems. The family relationships that anchor Will's identity throughout his ordeal provide clear evidence of someone whose primary loyalties remain with people who have demonstrated consistent love and protection rather than with supernatural forces that have brought only pain and disruption to his life. His fierce protection of Joyce and Jonathan reflecting someone whose moral compass remains oriented toward defending the innocent rather than advancing causes that would harm them. His willingness to risk personal safety for their welfare, demonstrating values that are incompatible with villainous transformation. The friendship bonds that sustain Will through his darkest moments reveal someone whose capacity for trust and affection remains intact, despite experiences that might have justified complete withdrawal from human relationships. His continued investment in the well-being of Mike and Lucas and Dustin and Eleven, showing someone whose empathy has been strengthened rather than destroyed by suffering. His ability to maintain emotional connections despite supernatural trauma, indicating psychological resilience rather than moral corruption. The courage that Will demonstrates when facing supernatural threats shows someone who has learned to overcome paralyzing fear through determination to protect people he loves, rather than someone who has made peace with forces of darkness. His willingness to place himself at risk during crisis situations, revealing heroic instincts that have emerged from, rather than been destroyed by his traumatic experiences. His growth from victim to active participant in defending Hawkins, demonstrating character development that moves toward light rather than shadow. The psychological framework that would be required to support Will's transformation into ultimate villain would necessitate fundamental personality changes that contradict everything that has been established about his character. Through 4 seasons of consistent behavior under extreme pressure, his responses to supernatural influence, revealing someone whose essential nature resists rather than embraces the kind of moral flexibility that would be required to serve causes that harm innocent people. His demonstrated values making such transformation implausible without external coercion that would constitute continued victimization rather than chosen alliance. The strategic value that Will provides to his friends and family comes precisely from his maintained humanity and moral clarity, rather than from any special relationship with supernatural forces. His insights about upside-down activities proving useful because he retains perspective of someone who has experienced that realm's hostility and emerged with his ethical framework intact. His warnings carrying weight because they come from someone whose loyalty to human welfare remains uncompromised by his supernatural experiences. The final season's treatment of Will's ongoing connection to the Upside Down will likely demonstrate how trauma survivors can transform their painful experiences into sources of strength that serve protective rather than destructive purposes. His journey toward healing and integration of his supernatural sensitivity into healthy adult identity, representing triumph over rather than capitulation to forces that sought to claim him. His ultimate contribution to Vecna's defeat emerging from his refusal to allow past victimization to define his future choices or compromise his commitment to defending people who deserve protection from those who would exploit or harm them. The theory that suggests everything in Stranger Things exists only as an elaborate fantasy game unfolding in someone's basement, that all the supernatural terror and heroic sacrifice and genuine trauma experienced by beloved characters amounts to nothing more than dice rolls and imagination during extended Dungeons & Dragons session, represents perhaps the most emotionally devastating possibility that could be inflicted upon audiences who have invested years of caring and concern in the lives and struggles of people whose reality forms the foundation of everything meaningful about their journey through darkness toward light. The surface appeal of such revelation grows from the same psychological soil that nourishes our desire for comfort when confronted with stories that demand too much emotional investment, that ask us to witness suffering and loss that feels overwhelming in its scope and permanence. The dream scenario offering escape hatch from consequences that seem too heavy to bear when we have learned to love characters whose pain becomes our own, through the mysterious alchemy of narrative connection that transforms fictional experiences into genuine emotional reality. The circular elegance that would result from revealing the entire series as an elaborate game appeals to audiences who appreciate storytelling that returns to its origins with new understanding. The basement setting where Mike and his friends first encountered supernatural threats through tabletop adventures, providing perfect bookend for narrative that began with imagination and might theoretically conclude with the revelation that imagination was all it ever was. The dice and character sheets and miniature figures becoming symbols of creative power rather than props in real world where actual stakes demanded actual sacrifices. The protective instinct that drives such theories emerges from genuine love for characters who have suffered losses that feel disproportionate to any fictional framework. Eddie's death and Barb's disappearance and Max's injuries creating emotional wounds in audiences who care deeply about people whose welfare has become personal concern rather than abstract entertainment. The dream revelation offering possibility that beloved characters might somehow be restored to safety through the simple expedient of waking up from nightmare that was never real in the first place. The nostalgic comfort that would accompany such resolution appeals to viewers who remember childhood, when the boundaries between reality and imagination remained fluid enough that stories could be entered and exited at will, when games provided safe spaces for exploring danger and heroism without permanent consequences, when the worst outcomes could be undone through agreement to start over or through appeals to friendly dungeon master who understood that fun mattered more than rigid adherence to rules that made adventures too frightening or sad to continue enjoying. The meta-textual cleverness that such reveal would demonstrate appeals to audiences who appreciate storytelling that comments upon its own construction, that acknowledges the artificial nature of narrative, while simultaneously celebrating the power of shared imagination to create experiences that feel meaningful despite their fictional origins. The revelation that everything was game, potentially serving as tribute to the collaborative creativity that makes role-playing adventures satisfying for participants who understand that pretense can generate authentic emotions and genuine connections between people. Yet the fundamental betrayal that such revelation would represent becomes apparent when considered against the emotional investment that the series has deliberately cultivated through 4 seasons of careful character development and authentic consequence. The relationships and growth and sacrifice that have defined these people's journeys toward maturity and wisdom, carrying weight that depends entirely upon their reality within the fictional framework that audiences have accepted as foundation for caring about outcomes that affect people whose welfare matters, because their experiences have been presented as genuine rather than performative. The trauma that has shaped character development throughout the series would be rendered meaningless by revelation that suffering was merely imaginary. Joyce's desperate search for Will and her fierce protection of her children, losing all emotional resonance if reduced to role-playing exercise, rather than authentic maternal love. Tested by circumstances that demanded everything she had to give, her growth from anxious single mother to confident warrior becoming hollow achievement, if purchased through pretense rather than genuine courage, developed under pressure that threatened everything she held dear. Eleven's journey from laboratory subject to beloved daughter would lose its power to inspire if revealed as collaborative storytelling rather than genuine transformation. Her struggle to understand human connection and her gradual development of trust and affection becoming meaningless if experienced only through dice rolls and character sheets, rather than authentic emotional growth that occurred despite institutional abuse designed to prevent such healing. Her relationship with Hopper, representing triumph over trauma, only if that trauma was real enough to require genuine courage to overcome. The sacrifices that have given the series its moral weight would be trivialized by revelation that heroes never actually risked anything, that Bob's death to save Joyce and Will and Hopper represented nothing more than decision to remove character from game rather than genuine choice to exchange life for others' safety, his courage in facing Demogorgons meaningless, if motivated by narrative convenience rather than authentic love that inspired ordinary person to attempt extraordinary things for people whose survival mattered more than his own comfort or security. The friendships that provide emotional foundation for everything meaningful in the series would become hollow constructs if revealed as elaborate role-playing exercise. The loyalty between Mike and Will and Lucas and Dustin losing authenticity if based on gaming personas rather than genuine affection developed through shared experiences that tested their commitment to each other, their willingness to face supernatural threats together becoming performance rather than proof of bonds strong enough to sustain them through challenges that revealed character and strengthened relationships through adversity. The evil that Vecna represents would lose all moral significance if reduced to imaginary antagonist rather than genuine threat to innocent people. His philosophy of human weakness and his conviction that reality should be reshaped according to his vision, becoming merely creative exercise rather than ideological challenge that demands heroic response from people whose values refuse to accept that power should be exercised without mercy or restraint. His defeat meaning nothing, if victory costs nothing, and heroism requires no actual courage or sacrifice. The growth that characters have demonstrated through their supernatural experiences would become arbitrary rather than earned if revealed as products of collaborative storytelling rather than authentic development under pressure. Nancy's evolution from concerned student to investigative journalist, losing significance if based on imaginary rather than genuine encounters with institutional corruption and cover-up, her courage in pursuing truth despite personal risk becoming performance rather than demonstration of integrity that prioritized public welfare over individual safety. The community that has emerged around shared struggle against supernatural threats would be rendered artificial if revealed as gaming group rather than genuine network of mutual support developed through crisis that taught people to depend upon each other for survival. The bonds between families and neighbors becoming hollow if based on pretense rather than authentic recognition that individual welfare depended upon collective strength and willingness to protect vulnerable members, regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. The horror that has defined the series' exploration of evil and its impact on innocent people would lose all psychological power if revealed as consensual entertainment, rather than genuine threat to characters whose safety and happiness mattered to audiences who had learned to care about her welfare, the nightmares and trauma and ongoing psychological damage becoming meaningless if experienced only through imagination, rather than authentic consequence of encounters with malevolent forces that genuinely endangered everything valuable about normal human existence. The hope that sustains characters through their darkest moments would become hollow comfort if revealed as collaborative fiction rather than genuine resilience developed through faith in values that transcended immediate circumstance. Their ability to continue fighting, despite overwhelming odds, losing inspirational power, if based on knowledge that defeat carried no permanent consequences, rather than authentic courage that persisted despite understanding that failure might cost everything they had worked to protect and preserve. The legacy that heroic actions create within the series would be stripped of meaning if revealed as temporary game state rather than permanent contribution to community welfare. The example that brave choices provide for others becoming empty gesture, if costs were imaginary and benefits existed only within fictional framework rather than authentic demonstration that individual choices could make difference in outcomes that affected real people whose lives improved because someone chose service over safety. The tears that audiences have shed for characters who suffered and died would be transformed into evidence of manipulation rather than appropriate response to genuine tragedy. The emotional investment that makes stories meaningful, becoming source of embarrassment, rather than testament to narrative power that created authentic connection between viewers and people whose fictional existence generated real feelings of love and loss and hope and fear that enriched rather than diminished human experience through expansion of empathy and understanding. The theories that propose time travel as solution to the accumulated tragedies and irreversible losses that have marked Stranger Things' journey through 4 seasons of supernatural crisis represent perhaps the most seductive form of narrative escapism. The possibility that some device or portal or previously unknown psychic ability might allow beloved characters to rewind history and resurrect the dead, to reset Hawkins, like cosmic do-over that would restore everyone to safety while erasing the painful consequences that have given their heroic choices meaning and weight throughout their struggle against forces that demanded everything they had to give. The emotional appeal of temporal solutions grows from the same soil that nourishes our deepest wishes about mortality and permanence, the universal human desire to undo mistakes and prevent tragedies that seem too cruel to accept as final. Our hearts crying out against the injustice that allows good people to suffer while evil flourishes. The fantasy of second chances, offering comfort to audiences who have learned to love characters whose losses feel disproportionate to any reasonable framework for distributing pain and joy among people who deserve better outcomes than reality typically provides. The precedent that science fiction has established for time travel as narrative mechanism creates expectation that stories involving advanced technology and interdimensional phenomena might eventually reveal temporal manipulation as available option for heroes whose conventional weapons prove inadequate against threats that operate beyond normal physical limitations. The genre's history of using time loops and paradoxes to resolve seemingly impossible conflicts, providing template that seems applicable to situation where supernatural enemies possess advantages that might require unconventional responses. The symbolic framework that already exists within the series seems to provide foundation for temporal theories, the Upside Down's eternal preservation of Hawkins. At the exact moment when the first gate opened, creating visual metaphor that could theoretically be interpreted as literal mechanism rather than thematic representation. The frozen tableau of November 6, 1983 offering tantalizing suggestion that time itself has become malleable within supernatural realm where normal rules about causality and progression might not apply. The dramatic satisfaction that would result from undoing the most heartbreaking losses appeals to audiences whose emotional investment in character welfare makes permanent separation feel unnecessarily cruel. Bob's heroic death and Eddie's willing sacrifice, and Barb's innocent disappearance, representing wounds in the narrative fabric that time travel might theoretically heal through careful manipulation of events that led to tragedy, the possibility of restoration, offering hope that love might prove stronger than death when armed with appropriate technology. The scientific plausibility that quantum mechanics and theoretical physics provide for temporal manipulation creates intellectual foundation that makes time travel seem less like pure fantasy and more like logical extension of phenomena that have already been established within the series. The interdimensional gates and psychic abilities that define supernatural elements, suggesting that reality itself is more flexible than conventional understanding assumes. The boundaries between possible and impossible becoming blurred in universe where consciousness can reshape matter. Yet the fundamental misunderstanding that underlies such theories becomes apparent when examined against the deliberate symbolic framework that the series has constructed around its treatment of time and memory, the frozen upside down, serving not as mechanical device for temporal manipulation, but as psychological representation of how trauma preserves painful moments in consciousness that refuses to move forward. The eternal November night reflecting emotional rather than literal relationship between past and present that cannot be resolved through technological intervention. The careful attention that the series has paid to consequences and their permanent impact on character development would be undermined rather than enhanced by revelation that mistakes could be undone through temporal mechanics, the growth that heroes have achieved through facing irreversible loss, losing all meaning. If tragedy proved to be temporary setback, rather than fundamental challenge that demanded authentic courage and genuine transformation, their maturity, purchased through suffering, becoming hollow achievement, if pain could be erased through convenient plot device. The moral framework that gives heroic choices their weight depends entirely upon the understanding that actions carry permanent consequences that cannot be recalled or revised. Hopper's willingness to sacrifice himself to close the gate, gaining significance from his acceptance that some prices must be paid regardless of personal cost. His courage meaningful precisely because he understood that heroism sometimes requires permanent surrender of everything valued most. His example inspiring others only because his choice was irrevocable. The relationships that have been forged through shared tragedy would lose their special intensity if the experiences that created such bonds could be undone through temporal manipulation. Joyce and Hopper's deep connection emerging from their mutual understanding of loss and their shared determination to protect children who had already suffered too much. Their love gaining authenticity through recognition that both had been changed permanently by circumstances that demanded growth rather than retreat from responsibility that parenthood and community leadership required. The enemy that Vecna represents operates according to philosophical principles that extend far beyond tactical concerns about timeline manipulation. His conviction that human beings are inherently weak and deserve subjugation, reflecting worldview that would not be altered by changes to specific historical events. His power stemming from psychological rather than temporal sources that would remain intact, regardless of attempts to prevent his initial transformation through modification of past circumstances that shaped his development. The horror that defines the series' exploration of evil and its impact on innocent lives depends upon the understanding that some damage cannot be repaired through external intervention. That trauma creates lasting changes in people who experience it, regardless of whether the original threat can be eliminated. The psychological wounds that characters carry, serving as testament to authenticity of their experiences, rather than temporary disabilities that might be healed through restoration of previous timeline. The community that has emerged around shared struggle against supernatural threats gains its strength from collective recognition that everyone has been changed permanently by what they have witnessed and endured. Their mutual support based on understanding that healing requires acknowledgement of damage rather than denial of its reality. Their bonds created through acceptance of loss rather than fantasy that tragedy might be prevented through manipulation of events that have already occurred. The sacrifice that gives heroic actions their moral weight becomes meaningless if heroes possess knowledge that death is temporary inconvenience rather than ultimate gift offered in service of people whose welfare matters more than individual survival. The courage required to face mortality for others' sake, losing all significance if resurrection remains available option. The choice between safety and service becoming calculation rather than demonstration of values that prioritize collective good over personal comfort. The growth that characters have demonstrated through their supernatural experiences reflects authentic development that occurred in response to irreversible circumstances rather than temporary conditions that might be modified through temporal intervention. Nancy's transformation from sheltered teenager to determined investigative journalist representing permanent change in personality and priorities that emerged from encounters with evil that could not be undone or forgotten. Her courage earned through facing rather than avoiding difficult truths. The legacy that heroic choices create within their community depends upon the understanding that actions have lasting impact on people whose lives are improved by examples of courage and sacrifice. The inspiration that brave decisions provide for others losing power, if recipients understand that heroism carries no permanent cost. The moral education that comes through witnessing authentic courage, becoming hollow lesson if students know that consequences can be erased through convenient mechanisms. The hope that sustains characters through their darkest moments emerges from their recognition that meaning can be found in present circumstances despite past losses, rather than through fantasy that past might be changed to eliminate. Présent pain, their resilience based on acceptance of reality rather than denial of its permanence. Their ability to continue fighting rooted in understanding that current choices matter, regardless of previous outcomes that cannot be altered. The emotional investment that audiences have made in these characters' journeys would be betrayed by revelation that growth and sacrifice and loss were merely temporary conditions that could be reversed through plot mechanism. The tears shed and joy celebrated becoming meaningless if experiences that generated such responses proved to be provisional rather than permanent. The relationship between viewers and beloved characters losing authenticity if based on illusion rather than genuine shared experience of irreversible change. The final season that approaches carries responsibility to honor the journey that brought everyone to this point rather than erasing the experiences that created current circumstances. The resolution that fans deserve requiring acknowledgement of what has been lost and celebration of what has been gained through struggle rather than magical restoration that would make the entire adventure feel like elaborate detour from predetermined happy ending that required no genuine courage or authentic transformation from people whose growth we have witnessed with admiration and love. The theory that seeks to connect the Wheeler and Creel families through hidden bloodlines, most commonly by suggesting that Karen Wheeler is actually Alice Creel, living under assumed identity after surviving the supernatural massacre that claimed her parents and brother decades ago, represents one of the most persistent forms of speculation that emerges when audiences become convinced that surface appearances must conceal deeper connections. That the careful attention paid to both families throughout the series cannot be coincidental, but must instead point toward revelations that would transform understanding of relationships that have been presented as separate but parallel journeys through small-town American life. The appeal of such family connection theories grows from the natural human tendency to seek patterns and meaning in circumstances that might otherwise seem random, the mind's desire to create coherence from scattered elements, finding satisfaction in possibilities that would link disparate storylines through bonds of blood and shared history, the dramatic potential of hidden relationships, offering promise of revelations that would recontextualize everything audiences thought they understood about characters whose lives have intersected in ways that seem too meaningful to result from simple geographical proximity. The visual evidence that proponents of this theory point toward typically involves careful analysis of background details and fleeting moments that might contain hidden significance, a poster glimpsed in peripheral vision, or a photograph positioned just so in the frame, a lingering camera shot that seems to invite deeper scrutiny, or a loaded glance that lasts only seconds but carries weight that suggests intentional foreshadowing rather than accidental composition. These fragments assembled into mosaic that promises to reveal picture too complex for casual viewing to detect. The timeline that would be required to support Karen Wheeler's identity as surviving Alice Creel creates framework that seems plausible when considered alongside the careful documentation of both families' histories. The age difference between Alice's childhood in the 1950s and Karen's adult life during the 1980s, providing sufficient gap for identity, reconstruction, and geographic relocation, the trauma that would motivate such drastic reinvention, offering psychological foundation for complete personality transformation that would allow frightened child to become suburban mother whose surface normalcy concealed unimaginable secrets. The behavioral patterns that characterize Karen Wheeler throughout the series could theoretically be interpreted as evidence of someone whose carefully constructed identity serves protective rather than authentic purposes, her occasional moments of distance or distraction, potentially reflecting the psychological cost of maintaining facade that requires constant vigilance against memories that threaten to surface and destroy the peaceful existence she has. Built through decades of determined forgetting, her sometimes strained relationship with Ted possibly stemming from the impossibility of complete intimacy when fundamental truths about identity must remain hidden. The thematic parallels between the Wheeler and Creel households provide rich material for speculation about deeper connections, both families representing different aspects of middle-class American life during periods when social conformity masked psychological complexity and domestic tranquility, often concealed tensions that could explode into violence or tragedy. The surface similarities in family structure and economic status, creating foundation for theories that would transform thematic resonance into literal kinship that explains apparent coincidences through blood relationships rather than cultural patterns. Yet the fundamental flaw that undermines such theories becomes apparent when examined against the thorough documentation that the series has provided regarding the Creel family tragedy and its aftermath. The careful attention paid to what happened to each family member during that terrible night in 1959, leaving no gaps or uncertainties that would permit alternative explanations for Alice's fate. The official records and institutional responses that followed the murders, creating paper trail that accounts for all participants in ways that preclude secret survivals or identity switches. The psychiatric evaluation and treatment that Henry received following his family's deaths included detailed documentation of Alice's condition and ultimate fate. The medical professionals who examined the scene and processed the survivors, creating official record that would be difficult, if not impossible, to falsify or conceal, particularly given the high-profile nature of the case and the institutional oversight that governed such investigations during the 1950s, when bureaucratic procedures required multiple forms of verification and confirmation before conclusions could be reached. The geographical and social connections that would have been necessary to support identity reconstruction on the scale required by this theory would have required resources and coordination that far exceeded what a traumatized child could have accessed or maintained. The logistics of creating completely new identity while avoiding detection by authorities who were actively investigating the case, presenting obstacles that would have been insurmountable without adult assistance, that itself would have left traces in official records that subsequent investigations would have discovered. The personality differences between Alice Creel, as documented in family photographs and witness accounts, and Karen Wheeler, as observed throughout 4 seasons of careful character development, reveal fundamental incompatibilities that extend far beyond what trauma and time could reasonably be expected to create. The spontaneous joy and innocent enthusiasm that characterized Alice's childhood, contrasting sharply with Karen's more measured and controlled approach to life, that suggests completely different temperamental foundations rather than the same person transformed by extraordinary circumstances. The family dynamics that define the Wheeler household reflect genuine relationships built through shared experience and gradual development, rather than the kind of careful performance that would be required if Karen were maintaining elaborate deception about her identity. Her interactions with Ted and the children carrying authenticity that emerges from authentic emotional investment, rather than studied behavior designed to maintain cover story that must never be questioned or examined too closely. The children who call Karen mother have developed relationships with her that span their entire lives and include countless private moments and intimate conversations that would have been impossible to sustain if she were anyone other than their actual parent. Nancy and Mike's trust in her judgment and their comfort with sharing personal concerns, reflecting bonds that grow only through genuine maternal care rather than performed affection that might fool outside observers but could never survive the scrutiny of daily family life. The community connections that Karen has maintained throughout her years in Hawkins include friendships and professional relationships that extend back to periods when fabricated identity would have been more vulnerable to detection. Her integration into local social networks requiring consistency of character and behavior over extended periods that would have been extremely difficult to maintain while concealing fundamental truths about personal history. Psychological development that shaped her responses to ordinary social situations. The psychological profile that would be required to support successful identity concealment of such magnitude would necessitate forms of compartmentalization and emotional control that seem inconsistent with Karen's demonstrated capacity for spontaneous feeling and genuine concern for her family's welfare. Her authentic worry about her children's safety and her real affection for Ted, suggesting someone whose emotional responses emerge from actual, rather than performed relationships. The supernatural sensitivity that Alice Creel would likely have retained after exposure to Henry's abilities, and the traumatic events that claimed her family would almost certainly have manifested during the supernatural crises that have affected Hawkins throughout the series, particularly given the proximity of her supposed new family to many of the key events and people involved in the ongoing conflict with upside-down forces that would have triggered recognition or psychic response in someone whose childhood included exposure to similar phenomena. The thematic function that both families serve within the larger narrative framework provides sufficient explanation for apparent parallels without requiring literal blood connections. The Wheeler household representing suburban normalcy that supernatural forces threaten to disrupt, while the Creel family demonstrates what happens when evil takes root within domestic spaces that should provide safety and love. The contrast between their fates illustrating different outcomes that result from how communities respond to hidden darkness in their midst. The moral framework that gives both families their significance within the series depends upon their representation of distinct approaches to family life and social responsibility, rather than secret connections that would complicate rather than clarify the themes they embody. Karen Wheeler's role as protective mother, gaining meaning through her genuine love for children she has raised, rather than through hidden trauma that would transform her maternal instincts into performance driven by guilt or fear, rather than authentic affection. The resolution that approaches with the final season will likely demonstrate that the most profound connections between people emerge from shared values and mutual support, rather than genetic accidents or hidden histories. The bonds that have sustained characters through supernatural crisis proving stronger than blood when tested by circumstances that reveal true character and authentic commitment to protecting what matters most, regardless of personal cost or family origin. The theories that propose hidden depths to Jim Hopper's character through supernatural abilities or secret biological connection to Eleven represent fundamental misunderstanding of what makes his journey through grief and redemption so powerful. The speculation that he possesses dormant psychic powers, or that he serves as Eleven's actual father, missing entirely the point of relationships that derive their meaning from choice rather than destiny, from human determination rather than genetic advantage, from ordinary courage exercised in extraordinary circumstances rather than special abilities that would diminish the significance of his transformation from broken man to protective father figure. The appeal of theories that would grant Hopper psychic abilities grows from audiences' desire to find supernatural explanations for his remarkable resilience and his uncanny ability to survive situations that would overwhelm ordinary people. His repeated escapes from seemingly impossible circumstances, creating impression that luck alone cannot account for his success against enemies who possess overwhelming advantages in terms of resources and otherworldly support. The pattern of unlikely survival suggesting hidden factors that might explain his effectiveness against threats that have defeated others with superior training or equipment. The military background that shaped Hopper's approach to crisis management provides more mundane, but ultimately more meaningful explanation for his tactical instincts and his ability to function under extreme pressure. His service in Vietnam teaching him lessons about survival and leadership that prove applicable to supernatural warfare, despite the vast differences between human enemies and interdimensional monsters. His combat experience providing foundation for courage that emerges from training and psychological preparation, rather than mystical enhancement or genetic predisposition toward heroism. The psychological profile that Hopper presents throughout his journey from alcoholic exile to beloved father figure demonstrates character development that results from conscious choices to embrace responsibility rather than flee from it. His evolution from someone who numbed pain through substance abuse into someone who channels grief into protective instincts, reflecting human capacity for growth and transformation that requires no supernatural intervention to achieve. Remarkable results when motivated by love for people whose welfare matters more than personal comfort or safety. The theory that positions Hopper as Eleven's biological father appeals to audiences who appreciate dramatic revelations that recontextualize established relationships. The possibility that their bond runs deeper than adoption, creating framework for emotional intensity that seems to transcend what adoptive relationships typically achieve. Yet this speculation fundamentally misunderstands the entire thematic foundation that makes their connection so meaningful to viewers, who understand that chosen family often creates stronger bonds than genetic accident. The timing that would be required to support biological relationship between Hopper and Eleven creates chronological problems that cannot be resolved without contradicting established facts about both characters' histories. His military service and subsequent marriage to Diane, occurring during periods that preclude romantic involvement with Terry Ives. While the documented circumstances surrounding Eleven's conception and birth leave no space for alternative paternity theories that would require complete reconstruction of carefully established backstories. The emotional weight that gives Hopper's adoption of Eleven its particular power comes precisely from the fact that their relationship was chosen rather than inherited. Two damaged souls finding healing through mutual care that emerged from recognition of shared need rather than biological obligation. His decision to accept responsibility for someone else's child representing triumph over the grief that had nearly destroyed him following Sarah's death. His willingness to risk everything for Eleven's safety demonstrating love that was earned rather than automatic. The parallel between Sarah and Eleven that drives Hopper's protective instincts operates on psychological rather than genetic level. His fierce devotion to his adopted daughter, stemming from understanding that he has been given second chance to be the father that death prevented him from remaining to his biological child. The opportunity for redemption requiring nothing more than human capacity for love and sacrifice that exists independent of supernatural enhancement or mystical connection. The legal framework that governs Hopper's adoption of Eleven creates official recognition of relationship that gains legitimacy through proper procedures rather than blood tests or genetic verification. The documentation that establishes her as his daughter, representing society's acknowledgement that families can be created through commitment and care, rather than requiring biological foundation to achieve legal and emotional validity. Their bond, recognized by community that understands parenthood as function rather than accident of genetics. The cabin that serves as their shared home becomes sanctuary, where healing occurs through daily routines and quiet conversations that build trust between two people who have learned that family means showing up consistently rather than sharing DNA. The domestic tranquility they create together, representing triumph over institutional forces that sought to prevent such connections by treating children as experimental subjects, rather than human beings deserving love and protection from adults willing to accept parental responsibility. The sacrifice that Hopper makes to close the gate gains meaning through his understanding that Eleven needs him to survive and thrive, his willingness to face apparent death for her sake, demonstrating parental love that emerges from commitment rather than biology. His choice to risk everything reflecting values that prioritize her welfare over his own survival, regardless of whether she carries his genetic material. The heroism measured by devotion rather than relationship status. The reunion that follows his presumed death creates emotional impact that depends entirely upon audiences' recognition that love transcends biological connection. The joy of their restored relationship, reflecting appreciation for bonds that were threatened by separation, rather than celebration of genetic destiny that could never be permanently severed. Their embrace carrying weight of chosen affection, rather than inevitable attraction between people who share blood. but might not share values or commitment. The supernatural abilities that some theories would grant Hopper fundamentally misunderstand his role as representative of human determination and ordinary courage. His effectiveness against otherworldly enemies, stemming from refusal to be intimidated by circumstances that exceed normal experience, rather than from psychic powers that would place him in same category as subjects whose abilities made them valuable to researchers seeking military applications for paranormal phenomena. The leadership that Hopper provides during supernatural crises emerges from experience and character rather than enhanced perception or mystical insight. His ability to coordinate responses and make tactical decisions under pressure, reflecting skills developed through military service and police work, rather than supernatural sensitivity that would diminish the significance of purely human courage applied to situations that demand more than ordinary people typically possess. The connection that Hopper maintains with Eleven during their separation operates through emotional rather than psychic channels, their mutual concern and dedication, creating spiritual bond that transcends physical distance without requiring telepathic communication or supernatural awareness. Their relationship sustained by memory and hope rather than paranormal abilities that would make their reunion less meaningful, because it was predetermined rather than achieved through determination and faith. The transformation that occurs in Hopper's character throughout his journey from grief to renewal demonstrates human capacity for healing and growth that requires no mystical intervention to achieve remarkable results. His evolution from someone who had given up on life into someone willing to fight impossible odds for others' sake, representing triumph of will over despair that speaks to universal potential for redemption when people find purposes larger than their own pain. The legacy that Hopper creates through his relationship with Eleven extends beyond their personal bond to encompass example he provides for other adults who might doubt their ability to make difference in children's lives. His success as adoptive father demonstrating that parenting skills emerge from commitment and consistency rather than genetic programming. His influence proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when motivated by love that prioritizes others' welfare over personal convenience. The final season will likely celebrate rather than complicate the relationship between Hopper and Eleven by demonstrating how their chosen family bond provides foundation for facing ultimate challenges together, their partnership representing human resilience and the power of authentic connection to overcome obstacles that might defeat individuals fighting alone, their love story serving as testament to possibility that damaged people can heal each other through mutual care and unwavering commitment to shared future, built on hope rather than biology. The theories that assign major plot significance to background characters who were never intended to carry such narrative weight represent perhaps the most misguided form of speculation that emerges when audiences become convinced that every person who appears on screen must possess hidden depths or secret abilities. The persistent belief that Ted Wheeler harbors dormant psychic powers, or that Holly Wheeler serves as unwitting conduit for supernatural forces, reflecting fundamental misunderstanding of how storytelling functions when it requires certain characters to remain ordinary in order for extraordinary ones to maintain their special significance within carefully constructed dramatic framework. The appeal of theories that would transform Ted Wheeler from oblivious suburban father into secret agent or hidden genius grows from audience discomfort with the possibility that some people might actually be exactly what they appear to be. His blank demeanor and apparent disconnection from family crises, creating vacuum that imagination rushes to fill with explanations that seem more interesting than the simple reality that not everyone possesses hidden depths or carries mysterious backstories that would justify closer examination of their motivations and capabilities. The pattern of behavior that Ted demonstrates throughout 4 seasons of consistent characterization reveals someone whose emotional unavailability and intellectual limitations serve specific narrative functions that would be undermined rather than enhanced by revelations about secret intelligence or covert operations. His role as representative of masculine inadequacy in suburban environments where real leadership falls to women and children who possess courage and moral clarity that he has never developed despite decades of comfortable, middle-class existence. The dinner table scenes where Ted sits reading newspapers while family members discuss supernatural crises that threaten their community provide perfect illustration of his function as symbol of willful ignorance rather than calculated performance designed to conceal deeper awareness of events that would demand action from someone whose character included capacity for heroism or even basic civic responsibility. His genuine obliviousness, serving as commentary on how easily people can insulate themselves from uncomfortable truths when confronted with evidence that challenges their preferred version of reality. The moments when Ted does engage with family concerns reveal someone whose responses emerge from actual personality limitations rather than strategic concealment of superior understanding. His awkward attempts at parental guidance and his confused reactions to teenage behavior patterns, demonstrating authentic bewilderment rather than carefully constructed facade designed to deflect attention from secret knowledge or hidden abilities that would make him valuable target for supernatural forces seeking human allies or unwitting collaborators. The theory that Holly Wheeler possesses psychic sensitivity or serves as unconscious early warning system for supernatural threats similarly misunderstands her narrative function as representative of childhood innocence that notices obvious phenomena without comprehending their larger significance. Her reactions to flickering lights and strange sounds, reflecting normal child development rather than evidence of enhanced perception that would place her in same category as subjects whose abilities attracted government attention and institutionnelle exploitation. The age that Holly represents during the series' exploration of supernatural crisis corresponds to developmental stage when children naturally possess heightened awareness of environmental changes without having learned adult patterns of selective attention that filter out information deemed irrelevant to immediate concerns. Her observations about household anomalies, reflecting typical childhood alertness rather than mystical sensitivity that would require explanation through genetic inheritance or accidental exposure to interdimensional phenomena. The protection that Holly receives from her family's collective decision to shield her from knowledge about supernatural threats demonstrates their understanding that some people deserve to maintain innocence rather than being drawn into conflicts that would corrupt or endanger them. Her parents' efforts to preserve her childhood, reflecting healthy adult responsibility, rather than recognition that she possesses abilities that would make her valuable asset in ongoing struggle against forces that target vulnerable individuals for recruitment or elimination. The camera attention that Holly receives during certain scenes serves cinematographic purposes related to visual storytelling rather than evidence of hidden plot significance. Her presence in frame during moments of supernatural activity, providing audience perspective that represents innocent observation without supernatural enhancement. Her reactions helping viewers understand that strange events are occurring without requiring her to possess special knowledge or enhanced perception that would complicate her role as protected family member. The tendency to assign secret abilities or hidden significance to quiet characters reflects audience assumption that narrative economy requires every person who appears on screen to serve multiple purposes, rather than understanding that effective storytelling often depends upon having characters who fulfill single functions without additional complications that would dilute focus from main dramatic themes, background figures gaining importance through their ordinariness rather than through revelation of extraordinary characteristics. The suburban environment that defines much of Stranger Things' setting depends upon population of normal people whose lack of awareness about supernatural threats creates atmosphere where heroes' knowledge and abilities stand out, in sharp relief against community backdrop of willful ignorance and comfortable complacency. The contrast between extraordinary individuals and ordinary citizens, providing dramatic tension that would be lost if everyone possessed hidden depths or secret connections to ongoing supernatural conflict. The family dynamics that govern Wheeler household interactions require Ted's genuine emotional distance and Holly's authentic innocence to create environment where Nancy and Mike's heroic development occurs despite rather than because of parental guidance. Their growth into courageous young adults representing triumph over family limitations rather than fulfillment of genetic destiny that would minimize their individual achievements through suggestion that heroism was inherited rather than earned through personal choice and moral development. The comic relief that Ted provides during moments of crisis serves important narrative function by highlighting absurdity of normal life, continuing unchanged while supernatural battles rage nearby, his ability to remain focused on trivial concerns, while his children risk their lives to save their community, creating ironic commentary on how easily people can avoid responsibility when confronted with problems that require sacrifice and courage rather than passive consumption of entertainment and comfort. The social commentary that emerges from Ted's characterization depends upon his authentic representation of certain types of American masculinity that prioritize personal comfort over civic engagement. His genuine disconnection from family and community needs serving as criticism of cultural patterns that encourage men to abdicate leadership responsibilities while expecting others to handle difficult, emotional, and practical challenges, that maintain social stability and family welfare. The protection of childhood innocence that Holly's character represents requires her to remain genuinely unaware of supernatural threats rather than possessing hidden knowledge that she conceals from adults who are trying to shield her from traumatic information. Her authentic lack of understanding about danger, allowing family members to maintain hope that some aspects of normal life can be preserved despite ongoing crisis that threatens to corrupt or destroy everything valuable about peaceful, domestic existence. The narrative focus that the series maintains on its central characters would be diluted rather than enhanced by revelations that background figures possess equal importance or hidden abilities that would require additional screen time and character development, the storytelling becoming scattered and unfocused. If too many people demanded attention as potential heroes or secret players, whose contributions to resolution of supernatural conflict required detailed exploration and emotional investment, from audiences whose capacity for caring about fictional characters has natural limitations. The final season will likely demonstrate that some characters serve the story best by remaining exactly what they have always been rather than being transformed into something more dramatic or significant. Ted's continued obliviousness and Holly's preserved innocence, providing stability and continuity that allows extraordinary characters to shine more brightly against backdrop of ordinary human limitation and protected childhood. that represents what heroes fight to preserve through their willing sacrifice and courageous action in service of community welfare and family protection. The theory that transforms Robin Buckley from authentic teenage experience into time-traveling operative sent from the future to assist the group in their supernatural struggles represents profound misunderstanding of her narrative, function as anchor point for normal human experience within extraordinary circumstances. Her role as someone whose intelligence and humor provide grounding for friends who might otherwise lose themselves in the overwhelming complexity of interdimensional warfare and psychic abilities that threaten to separate them from the poking, ordinary world where most meaningful human connections are formed and sustained. The appeal of theories that would grant Robin's secret mission from advanced civilization or mysterious organization grows from audiences' desire to find supernatural explanations for her remarkable adaptability and her uncanny ability to remain level-headed during crises that would overwhelm most people. Her quick thinking and resourceful problem-solving, creating impression that she possesses knowledge or training that exceeds what typical teenagers could reasonably be expected to develop through normal educational and social experiences within small-town environments. The science fiction framework that time travel theories would impose upon Robin's character conflicts fundamentally with the carefully established rules that govern supernatural phenomena within the series. The psychic powers and interdimensional portals that define otherworldly threats, operating according to principles based on mental energy and biological manipulation, rather than technological advancement or temporal mechanics that would require completely different theoretical foundation and practical applications. The authenticity that makes Robin's character so compelling to audiences who recognize themselves in her struggles with identity and social acceptance emerges from her genuine responses to unprecedented situations rather than from hidden knowledge or special training that would diminish the significance of her courage and quick thinking. Her effectiveness in dangerous circumstances stemming from natural intelligence, applied creatively to problems that have no obvious solutions, rather than from access to future information about optimal strategies. The friendship that develops between Robin and Steve provides perfect illustration of how ordinary people can form extraordinary bonds when tested by circumstances that reveal character and create mutual dependence. Their relationship growing from workplace cooperation through shared trauma into genuine affection that demonstrates human capacity for connection across social boundaries without requiring mystical intervention or predetermined destiny to explain why two such different personalities would choose to support each other through ongoing crisis. The linguistic abilities that Robin displays throughout her appearances reflect dedication to academic achievement and natural facility with foreign languages, rather than evidence of advanced education from futuristic institutions. Her knowledge of Russian and other tongues demonstrating the kind of intellectual curiosity and scholarly commitment that ambitious teenagers can develop when motivated by genuine interest in communication and cultural understanding rather than secret missions that would require such skills for covert operations. The humor that Robin brings to even the most dangerous situations serves essential narrative function by reminding audiences that laughter and human connection remain possible even when facing threats that exceed normal comprehension. Her ability to find absurdity in supernatural crisis, providing psychological relief for characters and viewers alike without requiring explanation through advanced psychological training or future knowledge about optimal coping mechanisms for interdimensional warfare. The anxiety that Robin experiences during supernatural encounters demonstrates authentic human responses to trauma and danger, rather than calculated performance designed to maintain cover identity. Her genuine fear and occasional panic attacks reflecting normal psychological reactions to abnormal circumstances, rather than sophisticated acting designed to conceal superior knowledge or enhanced capabilities that would make her less vulnerable to stress and psychological pressure than her apparent age and experience would suggest. The coming-of-age themes that define Robin's character development throughout her appearances depend upon her genuine navigation of adolescent challenges related to identity and acceptance, rather than upon revelation that her struggles were temporary assignment rather than authentic. Personal growth, her journey towards self-acceptance, and her gradual development of confidence, requiring real, emotional investment and authentic character development that would be undermined by disclosure of secret mission parameters. The social dynamics that Robin navigates within Hawkins High School reflect genuine teenage experience of someone whose intelligence and unconventional interests create challenges for forming friendships and romantic relationships within environments where conformity often determines social success. Her struggles with belonging and acceptance representing universal adolescent themes rather than cover story designed to explain temporary presence in community where she was conducting covert operations. The musical abilities that Robin demonstrates through her participation in band programs represent normal extracurricular involvement rather than specialized training for missions that might require particular skills. Her competence with instruments reflecting dedication and practice rather than enhanced coordination or advanced knowledge that would distinguish her from other students whose talents developed through conventional educational opportunities and personal commitment to artistic excellence. The retail employment that provides Robin with practical work experience and social connections operates according to normal patterns of teenage part-time jobs rather than serving as cover for intelligence operations. Her interactions with customers and co-workers, demonstrating genuine learning curve and authentic workplace relationships, rather than sophisticated performance designed to maintain false identity while gathering information or positioning herself for future mission requirements. The family background that shapes Robin's personality and values reflects ordinary middle-class upbringing, rather than elaborate backstory designed to support time-traveling identity. Her relationships with parents and siblings, demonstrating normal family dynamics with typical conflicts and affections, rather than carefully constructed cover story that would be necessary to explain her presence in Hawkins without arousing suspicion from authorities or community members who might investigate unusual circumstances. The academic performance that Robin maintains throughout her high school career reflects genuine intellectual capability and consistent effort rather than access to advanced educational materials or future knowledge about curriculum requirements. Her success in various subjects demonstrating natural curiosity and disciplined study habits rather than enhanced learning capacity that would result from exposure to superior educational methods or technological assistance. The personal growth that Robin experiences through her supernatural adventures represents authentic character development that occurs when ordinary people discover reserves of courage and capability they never knew they possessed. Her transformation from anxious teenager into confident young woman, reflecting natural maturation process accelerated by extraordinary circumstances rather than predetermined personality evolution that would occur regardless of external events or personal choices. The relationships that Robin forms with other characters in the group demonstrate her genuine investment in their welfare rather than professional obligation to protect assets who are important to mission success. Her willingness to risk personal safety for friends' sake, reflecting authentic emotional bonds rather than calculated decisions based on strategic considerations that would prioritize objective completion over individual relationships and personal loyalty. The future that awaits Robin as she approaches graduation and adult independence depends upon her continued growth as genuine person rather than revelation of her true identity and return to temporal origin point. Her college plans and career aspirations reflecting authentic teenage dreams rather than temporary cover story that would be abandoned. Once mission parameters were fulfilled and she could return to her actual time period and resume her real life. The legacy that Robin creates through her influence on friends and community emerges from her authentic presence and genuine care rather than from advanced knowledge or superior technology. Her contributions to group success reflecting human intelligence and courage, applied creatively to unprecedented challenges, rather than deployment of resources that exceed what normal people could reasonably be expected to possess or develop through their own efforts and moral development within established timeline and cultural context. The theories that envision redemption arcs for Henry Creel, the transformation of Vecna from irredeemable monster back into someone whose humanity might be salvaged through Eleven's compassion or therapeutic intervention, represent perhaps the most psychologically complex form of speculation that emerges from audiences' deep-seated belief in the possibility of healing and second chances, the hope that even the most damaged souls might find their way back to light. If approached with sufficient understanding and unconditional love, yet these theories fundamentally misunderstand the careful moral architecture that the series has constructed around questions of accountability and the limits of empathy when confronted with evil that chooses itself rather than being imposed from outside. The emotional appeal of villain redemption theories grows from the same soil that nourishes our most cherished beliefs about human nature and the power of love to overcome even the darkest impulses. The possibility that someone who has caused immeasurable suffering might ultimately be reached through patient care and genuine understanding, offering hope that no one is permanently lost to shadow, that the capacity for good exists even in hearts that have been consumed by hatred and convinced of their own righteousness in spreading pain and destruction throughout communities that deserve protection rather than punishment. The precedent that popular culture has established for last-minute villain redemptions creates expectation that stories which explore trauma and institutional abuse might ultimately reveal that even the most terrible antagonists were victims first, their evil emerging from damage that could theoretically be healed through appropriate therapeutic intervention, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that might allow wounded souls to remember who they were before pain transformed them into agents of destruction rather than healing. The genre's history of such transformations providing template that seems applicable to someone whose abilities were discovered and exploited during vulnerable developmental period. The relationship between Henry and Eleven that has been established through their shared experience within laboratory environments creates foundation for theories about mutual understanding that might transcend their current roles as enemy and protector, their parallel development under institutional control, suggesting possibilities for connection based on shared trauma rather than ideological opposition. The recognition that both were children when first exposed to supernatural abilities, offering hope that underneath his monstrous exterior, some vestige of the sensitive boy might remain accessible to someone who understands what such experiences can do to developing minds. The therapeutic framework that modern psychology provides for understanding trauma and its treatment creates intellectual foundation for believing that even severe personality disorders and moral corruption might be addressable through appropriate intervention. The advances in mental health treatment that have occurred during recent decades suggesting that conditions once considered hopeless might actually respond to patient care and evidence-based approaches that address root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. The possibility that Henry's evil represents treatable condition rather than fundamental character defect. Yet the careful documentation that the series has provided regarding Henry's character development reveals someone whose trajectory toward evil began long before laboratory intervention occurred. His childhood murders of family members, demonstrating capacity for calculated cruelty that emerged from philosophical conviction rather than psychological damage, his calm satisfaction in causing suffering, reflecting worldview that was developed independently of institutional abuse, rather than resulting from external trauma that might excuse or explain his later choices to embrace rather than resist. Opportunities for inflicting pain. The Creel House massacre that Henry orchestrated as adolescent demonstrates level of premeditation and moral reasoning that indicates someone who understood exactly what he was choosing when he decided to end his family's lives. His ability to manipulate circumstances and conceal his involvement, revealing sophisticated understanding of right and wrong that makes his selection of evil represent authentic moral choice rather than confused response to overwhelming psychological pressure or institutional manipulation that might have compromised his ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. The philosophy that Henry develops and articulates throughout his appearances. As Vecna demonstrates coherent worldview based on conviction that human beings are fundamentally weak and deserve subjugation rather than protection, his ideology emerging from careful observation and intellectual analysis rather than emotional dysfunction or psychological disorder that might respond to therapeutic intervention. His certainty about human inadequacy, reflecting deliberate conclusion, reached through reasoning processes that operate independently of trauma or institutional conditioning. The pleasure that Henry derives from causing psychological torment to his victims reveals someone whose satisfaction comes from inflicting suffering rather than from achieving specific tactical objectives. His elaborate psychological torture of people like Max, demonstrating genuine enjoyment of cruelty rather than reluctant acceptance of necessary violence in service of larger goals. His creative approach to emotional destruction, suggesting someone who has chosen evil as preferred method of interaction, rather than being forced into such behaviors by circumstances beyond his control. The transformation of the Mind Flayer from natural phenomenon into instrument of Henry's will demonstrates his active choice to weaponize supernatural forces in service of his vision for reality. His reshaping of interdimensional entity according to his own philosophical framework, revealing someone who sees himself as architect of new moral order rather than victim of forces that shaped him against his will. His assumption of leadership over supernatural realm, indicating someone who embraces rather than resents his role as agent of destruction and domination. The systematic targeting of vulnerable teenagers that characterizes Vecna's hunting patterns reflects calculated decision to prey upon people whose psychological suffering makes them easy targets rather than random selection of victims based on availability or convenience. His preference for traumatized young people revealing someone who understands emotional pain and chooses to exploit rather than alleviate it. His methodical approach to psychological torture, demonstrating planning and forethought that indicate clear moral agency rather than compulsive behavior driven by uncontrollable impulses. The laboratory experiments that shaped Henry's understanding of his abilities provided him with knowledge and power rather than trauma that corrupted his essential nature, his cooperation with research programs, and his manipulation of institutional systems, revealing someone who learned to use circumstances to his advantage rather than being victimized by them. His eventual escape and transformation into Vecna, representing fulfillment of long-held ambitions rather than desperate flight from unbearable conditions that had driven him beyond rational thought or moral reasoning. The victims that Henry has claimed throughout his years of supernatural terrorism include innocent people whose only crime was existing in community that he decided deserved punishment, their deaths serving no purpose beyond satisfying his conviction that human life has no intrinsic value and that reality should be organized according to principles that prioritize power over compassion. His willingness to destroy families and traumatize survivors, reflecting someone who has made peace with causing maximum suffering for philosophical rather than practical reasons. The moral framework that the series has established depends upon clear distinctions between those who choose evil, despite alternatives, and those who are driven to harmful behavior by circumstances beyond their control. The difference between Henry's deliberate embrace of cruelty and the defensive violence that heroes employ to protect innocent people, creating ethical boundaries that would be compromised rather than clarified by redemption arc that treated his philosophical convictions as symptoms rather than choices. The justice that his victims deserve requires acknowledgement that some harm cannot be undone through forgiveness or therapeutic intervention, that accountability sometimes demands permanent consequences for choices that deliberately inflicted irreversible damage on people whose suffering served no purpose beyond satisfying someone else's ideological preferences, the moral weight of their pain becoming meaningless if the person responsible for their trauma could be restored to community standing through revelation of hidden humanity. The example that Henry's fate provides for other characters depends upon clear demonstration that choices have consequences that cannot be avoided through appeals to sympathy or understanding, that moral agency carries responsibility that must be accepted regardless of personal history or psychological complexity. The educational value of his story, requiring audiences to understand that evil often emerges from rational decision-making rather than mental illness or environmental damage that might excuse harmful behavior. The resolution that approaches with the final season will likely demonstrate that some people serve the narrative better as irredeemable forces that test heroes' courage and commitment, rather than as patients who require healing, that the most meaningful victories sometimes require permanent separation from sources of harm, rather than integration through therapeutic intervention, that love and understanding have appropriate limits when confronted with evil that chooses itself and refuses redemption, despite opportunities for different paths. The theories that envision complete restoration and magical healing for all the damage that has accumulated throughout 4 seasons of supernatural warfare represent perhaps the most understandable yet ultimately destructive form of wishful thinking that emerges when audiences who have invested years of emotional energy in beloved characters cannot bear the thought of permanent loss or lasting consequence. The fantasy of perfect endings where death is reversed and trauma is erased, and communities are rebuilt without scars, offering comfort to hearts that have learned to care deeply about people whose suffering feels disproportionate to any reasonable framework for distributing pain and healing in worlds where love should protect the innocent from forces beyond their control. The emotional appeal of complete reset theories grows from the same psychological soil that nourishes children's bedtime stories, where heroes always triumph and villains are defeated without lasting cost to anyone whose welfare matters to the audience. The deep human need for narrative closure that provides comfort rather than challenge, resolution rather than realistic complexity. The promise that caring about fictional characters will be rewarded with outcomes that satisfy every emotional investment, rather than requiring audiences to accept that meaningful stories sometimes demand grief as price for authentic connection to people whose lives mirror the unpredictable mixture of joy and sorrow that characterizes actual human experience. The precedent that fantasy literature has established for miraculous resurrections and magical healing creates expectation that stories involving supernatural elements might ultimately reveal powers capable of undoing even the most devastating losses. The genre's history of last-minute salvation through divine intervention or previously unknown abilities providing template that seems applicable to situation where interdimensional forces and psychic abilities suggest that normal rules about mortality and permanent consequence might not apply to characters whose extraordinary circumstances might grant access to solutions that exceed ordinary human limitations. The montage possibilities that such theories envision typically involve scenes of joyful reunion, where Bob and Eddie and Barb return to embrace families and friends who thought they were lost forever, the dead restored to life through some combination of temporal manipulation and supernatural healing. While Hawkins rebuilds itself into perfect small-town paradise, where children can ride bicycles through tree-lined streets, without fear that monsters might emerge from alternate dimensions to threaten their innocent adventures. The vision of restored normalcy offering psychological comfort to viewers who want happy endings for people they have learned to love. The theological framework that some audiences bring to their interpretation of supernatural stories creates expectation that ultimate justice requires restoration of all losses and healing of all wounds. The belief that meaningful narratives should demonstrate divine mercy rather than tragic realism, that characters who suffer through no fault of their own deserve compensation that exceeds what earthly circumstances typically provide. The hope that storytellers who ask audiences to witness pain and sacrifice will ultimately provide resolution that validates faith in benevolent universe, where good intentions are rewarded appropriately. Yet the fundamental betrayal that such resolutions would represent becomes apparent when examined against the careful construction of emotional investment that has characterized the series throughout its exploration of how ordinary people respond to extraordinary circumstances. The relationships and growth and moral development that have defined character journeys depending entirely upon understanding that choices carry permanent weight and that love requires willingness to accept loss as inevitable consequence, of caring about people whose lives cannot be controlled or protected through wishful thinking or narrative convenience. The sacrifice that has given heroic actions their moral significance throughout the series would be rendered meaningless by revelation that death was temporary inconvenience rather than ultimate price paid for others' welfare. Bob's courage in facing demogorgons to save Joyce and Will and Hopper, losing all emotional impact if his choice was reversed through magical intervention rather than honored as permanent gift that demonstrated what love looks like when tested by impossible circumstances. His heroism measured by willingness to accept finality rather than by knowledge that resurrection remained possible option. The growth that characters have achieved through learning to carry grief and find meaning despite irreversible loss would become hollow accomplishment if the painful lessons that taught them courage and compassion could be erased through supernatural convenience. Joyce's transformation from anxious single mother into fierce warrior, losing significance if her journey through trauma proved to be temporary experience rather than permanent change in someone whose love for her children required her to develop strength she never knew she possessed when comfortable circumstances no longer provided adequate protection. The community bonds that have been forged through shared struggle against supernatural threats would lose their special intensity if the experiences that created such connections could be undone through magical reset. The mutual support and understanding that developed among people who faced impossible odds together, becoming artificial construct rather than authentic relationship, built upon recognition that survival required cooperation and sacrifice, that some members might not survive, their loyalty to each other gaining meaning through acceptance of loss rather than fantasy that everyone could be preserved. The moral education that audiences have received through witnessing authentic consequences for heroic choices would be transformed into meaningless manipulation if the tears shed and lessons learned proved to be based on illusion, rather than genuine investment in people whose fictional existence generated real emotions. The relationship between viewers and beloved characters losing authenticity if growth and grief were revealed as temporary states rather than permanent changes that enriched understanding of what love costs when exercised in dangerous circumstances. The psychological realism that has distinguished Stranger Things from purely escapist entertainment depends upon its willingness to show that trauma creates lasting changes in people who experience it, that healing requires acknowledgement of damage rather than magical erasure of painful memories, that resilience emerges through learning to integrate rather than eliminate difficult experiences. The characters' ongoing struggles with supernatural aftermath, representing authentic responses to extraordinary circumstances, rather than temporary disabilities that could be cured through appropriate intervention. The thematic coherence that has sustained the series through multiple seasons of increasingly complex supernatural mythology would be destroyed by resolution that prioritized comfort over truth, that chose wish fulfillment over emotional honesty. The careful balance between childlike wonder and adult consequence that has characterized the show's exploration of how innocence survives contact with genuine evil, requiring acknowledgement that some damage cannot be repaired through good intentions or magical thinking, that maturity sometimes demands acceptance of imperfect outcomes. The institutional critique that runs throughout the series, as examination of how authorities fail to protect vulnerable populations, would lose its power if magical solutions eliminated the need for systemic change and personal responsibility. The government cover-ups and corporate negligence and community denial that enabled supernatural crisis becoming irrelevant concerns. If ultimate resolution demonstrated that individual and collective choices carried no permanent consequences, the social commentary becoming meaningless if problems could be solved through supernatural intervention rather than human commitment to justice and accountability. The coming-of-age themes that define the younger characters' development would be undermined by revelation that growing up was optional rather than inevitable consequence of witnessing adult failures and accepting responsibility for protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Their transformation from children who played games involving imaginary monsters into young adults who face real dangers, requiring genuine courage, becoming hollow achievement. If maturity could be avoided through magical restoration of innocence that was lost through necessary encounters with evil, the final season that approaches carries responsibility to honor the journey that brought everyone to this point, rather than erasing the experiences that created current circumstances. The resolution that fans deserve, requiring celebration of growth achieved through struggle, rather than magical restoration, that would make the entire adventure feel like elaborate detour from predetermined happy ending. The the conclusion gaining meaning through demonstration that love and courage and sacrifice matter precisely because they cost something that cannot be recovered through wishful thinking or narrative convenience. The legacy that will remain after the series concludes depends upon its commitment to showing that meaningful stories require audiences to risk genuine emotion, rather than promising that such investment will always be rewarded with outcomes that eliminate the possibility of loss. The relationship between viewers and beloved characters gaining authenticity through shared acceptance that caring about people involves accepting vulnerability to grief, while discovering that love transcends physical presence when based on authentic connection rather than fantasy that death is reversible circumstance rather than fundamental condition that gives life its precious urgency and moral weight. The distinction between theories that enhance narrative understanding and those that would destroy the very foundation upon which meaningful storytelling depends reveals itself most clearly when examined through the lens of internal consistency and respect for established rules. The difference between speculation that works with the carefully constructed framework that has been built over 4 seasons of meticulous world building and theories that would require abandoning everything that makes the series coherent and emotionally satisfying in favor of dramatic revelations that prioritize shock value over narrative integrity and sustainable character development. Good theories emerge from deep engagement with the text itself, rather than from desire to impose external expectations upon story that has already demonstrated its own internal logic and thematic priorities. The most compelling speculation growing organically from seeds that have been planted throughout the series, rather than requiring writers to abandon established patterns and character trajectories in favor of developments that would feel foreign to the world they have created through careful attention to consistency and authentic emotional progression within supernatural framework that operates according to recognizable rules. The framework that governs effective speculation includes respect for character psychology as it has been established through multiple seasons of consistent behavior under varied circumstances, theories that work with rather than against demonstrated personality traits, and moral frameworks that have been tested by extreme pressure and revealed through choices that characters make when facing impossible odds, their responses to crisis and trauma and opportunity, creating foundation for predictions about future behavior that honor their established identity rather than requiring fundamental transformation that would make them unrecognizable. The timeline that has been carefully constructed throughout the series provides another essential element that good theories must acknowledge and incorporate rather than ignore or contradict: the chronological framework that governs character, ages, and historical events, and the sequence of supernatural incidents, creating boundaries within which speculation can operate productively without requiring revision of established facts that have been confirmed through multiple sources, and narrative techniques, the internal consistency that makes fictional worlds believable depending upon respect for temporal logic that cannot be violated without damaging audience trust. The rules that govern supernatural phenomena within the series have been established through careful exposition and demonstration across multiple seasons. The psychic abilities and interdimensional portals and creature behaviors operating according to principles that have been consistently applied and thoroughly explored. Good theories building upon this established foundation, rather than introducing new elements that would require complete restructuring of everything audiences understand about how supernatural forces interact with human characters and normal reality within carefully constructed fictional universe. The thematic coherence that has sustained the series through increasingly complex storylines depends upon recognition that certain ideas and values have been central to its identity from the beginning. The exploration of family bonds and community loyalty, and the triumph of love over fear requiring speculation that honors these foundational themes rather than undermining them through revelations that would transform the series into something fundamentally different from what audiences have learned to appreciate and expect based on consistent narrative choices. The emotional investment that audiences have made in specific characters and relationships creates responsibility for theorists to respect the bonds and development that have been carefully cultivated, rather than suggesting developments that would cheapen or negate the growth that has occurred. Through authentic struggle and mutual support, good theories enhancing rather than diminishing the significance of connections that have been forged through shared experience and demonstrated loyalty under pressure that tested everyone involved. The surprising revelations that have provided some of the series' most memorable moments demonstrate how genuine plot twists work within established framework rather than against it. Eleven's connection to Henry Creel and the origin of the Mind Flayer feeling both unexpected and inevitable because they emerged from careful foreshadowing and consistent internal logic rather than contradicting everything that had been established about character backgrounds and supernatural mechanics. The satisfaction of such discoveries, depending upon recognition that clues were present for careful observers. The difference between earned surprises and arbitrary shock reveals itself through examination of how new information enhances understanding of previous events, rather than requiring audiences to discard their interpretation of everything that came before. Good plot developments, creating moments where viewers recognize that they should have seen the connections earlier, rather than feeling manipulated by information that could not have been anticipated based on evidence that was actually provided through careful storytelling and character development. The creative constraints that effective speculation must accept include recognition that final season has limited time to resolve established storylines and character arcs. The episode count and narrative priorities, requiring theories that can be integrated into existing framework rather than demanding extensive exposition or character development that would distract from conclusion of themes and relationships that have been central to series identity. Good speculation working with rather than against practical limitations of storytelling format. The audience expectations that have been established through 4 seasons of consistent tone and approach create boundaries within which satisfying conclusion must operate. The balance between hope and consequence that has characterized the series requiring resolution that honors both elements rather than abandoning either in favor of pure optimism or unrelenting darkness. Good theories recognizing that viewers have learned to expect complexity rather than simple answers to questions that involve moral ambiguity and competing loyalties. The legacy considerations that will determine how the series is remembered and evaluated require conclusion that feels worthy of the journey that brought everyone to this point. The resolution gaining significance through demonstration that time and emotional energy invested in these characters and their struggles was justified by outcome that honors their development while providing closure that satisfies without betraying the values and themes that made the series meaningful to audiences who care about quality storytelling. The collaborative nature of fan speculation at its best creates community of engagement where theories are tested against evidence and refined through discussion rather than defended against criticism. The most valuable contributions to understanding coming from people who approach the text with combination of love and analytical rigor that seeks to enhance appreciation rather than impose external agendas upon story that deserves respect. for its own internal coherence and artistic integrity. The celebration of creativity that emerges from genuine fan engagement recognizes that speculation itself can be a form of tribute to storytelling that has inspired imagination and emotional investment. The theories that honor rather than exploit the series, demonstrating appreciation for craft and care that went into creating fictional world rich enough to support multiple interpretations while maintaining clear identity that cannot be violated without losing essential character that makes it worth caring about in first place. The final judgment of any theory's value depends upon its ability to enhance rather than diminish the experience of engaging with beloved story. The best speculation, opening new avenues for understanding and appreciation while respecting the foundation that makes such exploration possible. The difference between theories that serve the story and those that would sacrifice narrative integrity for dramatic effect, revealing itself through honest examination of whether proposed developments would make the series better or merely different in ways that prioritize novelty over coherence and sustainable meaning. And so we close this gentle exploration of the theories that emerge from love, but wander far from the carefully constructed truths that make our beloved small town story so enduring and meaningful. Tonight we have journeyed through the quieter spaces of speculation, examining ideas that spring from genuine affection for characters whose welfare has become our own concern, yet understanding why some possibilities must remain forever in the realm of dreams where they can provide comfort without compromising the narrative integrity that gives their actual story its power to move and inspire us. From theories of hidden parentage to dreams of magical resurrection, from time travel solutions to villain redemptions, we have seen how the heart's desire for perfect endings conflicts with the story's commitment to authentic consequence and earned resolution. Rest now in the knowledge that the most satisfying conclusions honor the journey that brought us here, rather than erasing the experiences that created growth and connection. That meaningful stories respect their audiences enough to provide genuine stakes and real consequences. That love transcends physical presence when based on authentic bonds rather than wishful thinking. Sweet dreams from Hawkins, where the greatest theories are the ones that celebrate what is, rather than demanding what never could be.